Chair thanks the gentleman for his insight. Subcommittee on Health will now come to order. I'll recognize myself 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. From last year's 21st Century Cures Act to this year's Food and Drug Administration reauthorization, this subcommittee has been committed to bringing federal regulation into the modern era of medicine. Today, we continue that work by examining legislation to update the regulatory framework affecting the dissemination of truthful and non-misleading information about products approved by the Food and Drug Administration. I practiced medicine for several decades. I know firsthand how challenging it can be for providers to stay up to the minute with cutting-edge information in both medicine and science. Following the Food and Drug Administration's approval of a product, the use of that product rapidly evolves based on patient and provider experience. Frequently, the standard of care for a condition is outside of the Food and Drug Administration approved labeling. Ensuring that healthcare providers have access to new information generated by real-world evidence is critical to optimizing patient care and outcomes. Particularly in medicine, the old adage holds true, knowledge is power. Our legal framework for the regulation of manufacturer communications sometimes prevents healthcare professionals from receiving the most current scientific information available about the benefits and risks of FDA-approved medicines. A lack of relevant information can lead to physicians making patient care decisions with incomplete information. This is both unfair to the physician and unsafe for the patient. We owe it to the patient and medical communities to ensure that there is free and full dissemination of truthful and non-misleading scientific and medical information for healthcare professionals. I certainly want to thank two of our committee members, the Vice Chairman of the committee, Brett Guthrie, and Representative Morgan Griffith from Virginia for offering the bills that will be under discussion today. I feel they offer a targeted approach to addressing the problems presented by our regulatory framework for medical product communication. And if he would like time, I am prepared to yield to the gentleman from Kentucky if he would like time for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and sorry, there's another very important meeting on opioids going on downstairs, and we have our Kentucky Justice Secretary there. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing today to examine communications between manufacturers and healthcare payers, which I addressed in my bill, H.R. 2026, the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act. My bill will enable greater information exchange in order to guide health plans, pharmacy benefit managers, and others who develop prescription drug formularies and medical devices to make well-informed decisions about the benefits and costs of medications and medical devices for the populations they cover. Patients benefit when these formulary decisions are informed by the most recent and reliable scientific evidence on drugs and devices, beyond just what we learn from the clinical trials conducted by FDA approval. Our committee has addressed post-approval information exchange. We should take the next logical step by addressing what information can and should be exchanged pre-approval by considering the updated discussion draft we're examining today. I would like to submit for the record a letter of support for my bill into the record by a number of organizations, including Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, Humana, Sanofi, and Mayo Clinic.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair would like to recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, if he would seek time for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate it. Mr. Guthrie and I were both downstairs introducing former colleagues from the House of Delegates, so we apologize that we came rushing in, but we got that done. The draft version of my bill that we are discussing today will responsibly set the rules of the road so that manufacturers who have the most accurate and up-to-date information about their products can provide doctors and researchers with that information and in the appropriate context to improve patient care and facilitate additional research. Not only does a lack of clear rules have a public health ramification, but also it has legal consequences. There have been a number of court decisions that raise significant First Amendment questions about the FDA's authority to restrict a drug or device manufacturer from communicating truthful and non-misleading off-label information about their products. The judiciary branch should not be turned into de facto policymakers because of FDA's misunderstanding of the law or our inaction here in Congress. I remain open to any and all suggestions from both sides of the aisle and from stakeholders as to how this legislation may be improved, but I'm glad we're continuing the dialogue. I also look forward to hear from witnesses today about how the FDA's vague policies hinder the facilitation of information to healthcare providers and how this legislation could be a first step in addressing some of the challenges we will hear about. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Green. 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we're considering two draft bills addressing pharmaceutical manufacturer communications on medical products, the Medical Product Communications Act and the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act. Suggested changes of the rules surrounding the communications from medical product manufacturers will likely have far-reaching implications for the decisions made by healthcare providers about which therapies are appropriate for their patients. It's critically important for us to fully consider and appreciate the impact of those proposed changes could have on patient safety, health outcomes, and the promotion of value in our healthcare system. My concern with the two bills we're considering today is that as drafted, they would undermine public health, discourage pharmaceutical research, and undermine the FDA's central capacity to ensure medical products used on patients have demonstrated safety and efficiency. Opening the floodgates for off-label communication puts patients at risk, puts a dent in the armor that ensures patients get effective therapies and not snake oil. Broadening off-label communications could erode FDA's approval standard, as it would enable the uses of products never found to be safe or effective in patients and weaken consumer confidence in the FDA approval process. FDA's approval standard of safety and efficiency is considered to be the gold standard globally. As the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, has said, the most important incentive to developing useful information remains the ability for companies to market drugs based on what has been proven scientifically. There is an incentive currently for companies to seek FDA's approval for all uses of a drug product if they wish to market the product for those uses and gain coverage for these uses. Allowing manufacturers to communicate about unproven uses of their products reduces the incentive to go through the FDA's approval process, as clinical trials are the most expensive part of the development. Thus, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where a company seeks the narrowest indication for their product, gets on the market, and then foregoes on continuing large, well-controlled, randomized clinical trials that would prove a product is both safe and effective for broader populations or indications. Patients and doctors should fully be empowered to make joint decisions about their care. This includes the efficiency, risk, and cost of their options. Information is key, however, and the best decisions are based on accurate, evidence-based information, not just for information that may be incomplete, inconclusive, or at worst inaccurate. The discussion draft of the Medical Product Communication Act would not provide or ensure that patients and care providers have access to better research and evidence. Rather, it would allow drug manufacturers to communicate information about prescription drugs that have not been approved by the FDA. The lack of approval may be due to contradictory evidence or the lack of any evidence at all, or the need for additional research. While I have concerns with both discussion drafts as written, I do appreciate that our audience matters. The discussion draft of the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act would expand the ability of drug and device manufacturers to communicate healthcare economic information and scientific information to payers, formularies, technology review committees, or other entities about unapproved uses of products. These audiences are sophisticated and have an inherent interest in being skeptical of claims made outside products label, therefore is less problematic in its premise than the other bill we're considering. While I'm willing to work with my colleagues on the proposal, it's critical that these communications promote patient safety, public health, and the appropriate safeguards are in place to avoid damaging unintended consequences. As we consider the issue of off-label communication, we must always keep in mind that the way to truly help patients get the most effective treatments is to maintain the highest standards of safety and evidence and appropriate risk balance, benefit balance. Scientifically validated safety and efficiency and the incentives for manufacturers to seek FDA approval or clearance should be preserved. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And if anybody wants time, I'll yield my 45 seconds back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden. 5 minutes for an opening statement,
I
please.
thank the subcommittee chairman, Chairman Burgess. Thanks for holding this hearing. It's a really important topic, and it's a topic that has been important for our members for some time. Approximately 40% of prescriptions in the United States are for indications or uses not included in the FDA-approved product labeling. Although off-label uses of drugs and devices are often the recognized standard for care for treating many conditions, the lack of clarity in the statute and implementing regulations has stifled important information about such uses from being communicated in a responsible and non-promotional manner by manufacturers. The FDA has attempted to address this issue, but it's been in a piecemeal fashion over the last 2 decades with various non-binding guidance documents and policy statements that frankly fall woefully short, particularly given the criminal penalties in play. Now, the Supreme Court affirmed in 2011 that First Amendment commercial speech protections extend to medical product manufacturers. Every subsequent judicial decision, has raised significant questions about the extent of FDA's authority to restrict truthful and non-misleading off-label communications. So where are we today? The regulators and the courts have spoken. Everyone is left with a vast amount of uncertainty that does nothing to protect or benefit patients. So it's time for Congress to act. And as FDA's authorizing committee, it is our job to clarify this statute and get it right. Which brings us to this hearing. Neither of these bills are new to my fellow committee members. We discussed an earlier version of both bills during a markup in this subcommittee back in May, and we reviewed these updated versions of the full committee markup of the FDA Reauthorization Act last month. Both bills were ultimately withdrawn as amendments to FDARA with a commitment from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to work with us together to iron out a compromise so we could move these important policies forward and speak as the Congress and not leave this up to a mishmash of court decisions. So I look forward to continuing that work today. I believe Morgan Griffith's bill, H.R. 1703, is a serious, well-thought-out policy proposal that responsibly sets the rules of the road in a constitutionally sound manner. I greatly appreciate his willingness to continue to address concerns he's heard about the legislative language. I also appreciate Ranking Member Pallone's commitment at the user fee markup to work with us in good faith on this issue through regular order, which starts with this important hearing. In addition, Representative Guthrie's amended version of H.R. 2026 would clarify how drug and medical device companies can share health care, economic, or scientific information related to investigational uses of their products with payers and similar entities. These bills do not provide manufacturers with free rein to communicate any and all information about their products. They establish targeted statutory boundaries within which manufacturers may responsibly disseminate accurate and up-to-date information about medical products. These clarifications will lead to a better informed healthcare system. They will ensure that patients receive high-quality care based on current sound scientific and clinical information. Today, we continue the dialogue. I look forward to a productive discussion, and I appreciate the input of our witnesses who are before us today. And with that, unless there are other members who would like to use the balance of my time, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee. 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding today's hearing. The issue before us today is an important one, and I hope that our discussion today will help to inform whether or not it would be appropriate for this committee to take further action. Today, under current law, medical product manufacturers are required to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of each intended use of their medical product. This review process has been critical to protecting and promoting public health by ensuring that the benefits of medical products that are prescribed to patients outweigh the risks. It also is common sense. Just because a medical product approved for one use may be found to be safe and effective for that use doesn't necessarily mean that it will be safe and effective for another use or for another population. Recognizing that physicians may prescribe treatments off-label in response to individual patient needs, FDA allows the communication of truthful and non-misleading scientific or medical information regarding unapproved uses of medical products that may assist physicians in making treatment decisions. In those instances, FDA has allowed for manufacturers to respond to requests from physicians about unapproved uses and provide peer-reviewed journal articles, scientific or medical texts, and clinical practice guidelines. Following 21st Century Cures, manufacturers are also now able to share health care economic information with payers to help them better understand the economic benefits of an approved treatment. These are common sense approaches that allow doctors to address the individual needs of a patient, but also ensure that patients are not unnecessarily exposed to unproven or harmful medical products. Now, today, we're here to examine discussion drafts from Representatives Griffith and Guthrie that would greatly expand the types of scientific information that manufacturers could share without any FDA oversight. While I understand that medical product manufacturers have voiced concerns about their ability to communicate with doctors about their products, I'm concerned that these drafts would severely undermine the current protections against marketing unsafe and ineffective medical products. During this hearing, I hope to hear what materials manufacturers want to share with healthcare professionals and payers that they feel they can't under current law. The scientific exchange discussion drafts would severely restrict the types of evidence the FDA has always relied on to determine the intended use of a medical product. It would also hamstrung the agency from holding bad actors who distribute dangerous drugs or medical devices accountable. The pre-approval communication discussion draft would blow a hole in the current approval process by allowing the communication of any scientific evidence or healthcare economic information to payers or formularies without any recourse for the FDA to prevent bad actors from communicating false or misleading information. Allowing manufacturers to communicate about unapproved products and unapproved uses of their products reduces the incentive to go through FDA's approval process, and that is grossly irresponsible in my opinion. For example, the proposed discussion draft would allow for a manufacturer to publish a biased scientific study in any medium to constitute scientific exchange. This could simply include posting results of a non-peer-reviewed study on a company's website, and there's no requirement that this information be truthful. I'm also concerned that these two discussion drafts could expose more patients to medical products that have never been proven to be safe or effective. One study found that 81% of medications prescribed for off-label purposes had poor or no scientific support, while another found that patients who received off-label prescriptions were 54% more likely to experience an adverse event as compared to on-label use. And these are risks that we simply cannot ignore. So, Mr. Chairman, if there is a need for greater certainty and clarity on the types of communications that manufacturers are permitted to use under current law, I'm willing to have that discussion. However, broadening communication in the ways proposed under these discussion drafts would, in my opinion, undermine FDA's regulatory review process and the safety and effectiveness approval standard. I have about a minute. I don't know if anybody wants it. If not, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the chair. Thanks, gentlemen. This concludes member opening statements, and I would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the records. And we want to thank our witnesses for being here with us this morning, for taking time to testify before the subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give a summary of their opening statement, followed by questions from members. This morning, we're going to hear from Colleen Klassmeyer, partner of Sidley and Austin LLP, Alta Charo, the Warren Knowles Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin, Dr. George Van Hare, the Division Chief, Pediatric Cardiology, Louis Larrick Ward, Professor of Pediatrics at Washington University School of Pediatrics, and co-director of the St. Louis Children's and Washington University Heart Center. Aaron Kesselheim, Associate Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, Director, Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law from the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Linda House, the President of the Cancer Support Community, and Kat Wolf Kachatourian, Vice President, Delegation Oversight, Pharmacy Services of QualChoice Health Plan Services. We appreciate all of you being here today. And Ms. Klassmeyer, you are now recognized 5 minutes for the purpose of an opening statement. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Burgess, Vice Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Green, Chairman Walden, members of the subcommittee, my name is Colleen Klassmeyer. I'm a partner and the head of the FDA regulatory practice at Sidley Austin in Washington, D.C. I'm appearing today on behalf of the Medical Information Working Group. Today I'd like to make 3 points. First, FDA's rules governing manufacturer communications are neither clear nor precise. Decisions to prescribe and use lawfully marketed drugs and medical devices in ways that differ from the FDA-authorized labeling, so-called off-label use, are a constituent part of medical and surgical practice and can also be the standard of care. FDA has long recognized the need for prescribers to receive and for manufacturers to have some ability to provide information outside of product labeling to help support clinical decision-making. As a result, although a manufacturer is prohibited from promoting its product for new uses, it can lawfully provide information about off-label uses within defined circumstances. Currently, there are 4 safe harbors. Only one is set forth in a binding regulation. The others are in non-binding documents. They therefore lack the force of law. Moreover, 2 of the 4 safe harbors have been the subject of ongoing FDA proceedings since 2011. Under these policies, a manufacturer can provide off-label information, ostensibly without fear of enforcement, in 4 scenarios involving scientific exchange, responses to unsolicited requests, continuing education, and reprints of journal articles, reference texts, and clinical practice guidelines. Each safe harbor is subject to a number of qualifying criteria and additional requirements which are unclear in many key respects. Moreover, FDA has been unable to complete its process of revising the safe harbor policies, so questions frequently arise regarding the relationship between the old policies and the new policies. In addition, there's a lack of symmetry between the safe harbors that apply to drugs and those that apply to medical devices. In short, the safe harbors are a mess. As a result, manufacturers cannot confidently rely on the safe harbors, and that has public health consequences. For example, it is common for the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, a federal statutory advisory committee to the CDC, to make recommendations for vaccines that are arguably off-label. ACIP recommendations might vary the dosing schedule or recommend use of a vaccine in a new patient population. The vaccine manufacturer would reasonably fear that communicating about the ACIP recommendation to physicians or payers could be characterized by the government as unlawful off-label promotion. Ultimately, the public health would not be advanced because physicians would not receive manufacturer communications reinforcing that recommendation. The regulatory scheme also has legal consequences. The First Amendment case law makes clear that FDA is limited in its power to prohibit drug and device manufacturers from engaging in accurate communications about their products. FDA's regulatory scheme also implicates the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, which requires government agencies to establish rules that are clear and to give fair notice of what is prohibited, particularly in the context of free expression. Second, the existing FDA regulatory scheme for manufacturer communications is highly unstable. The lack of clear rules to allow manufacturers an appropriate measure of latitude to communicate about their products is only a part of the problem. FDA and the Justice Department impose aggressive restraints on manufacturer speech. Although manufacturers have indeed settled many cases involving off-label promotion allegations in recent years, in some instances, individuals and firms have raised First Amendment arguments in court, and those arguments have succeeded. FDA's regulatory scheme continues to burden constitutionally protected speech and is therefore at risk from additional lawsuits. The Medical Information Working Group has, for more than 10 years and across more than 20 submissions, requested targeted clarifications to the existing FDA safe harbors and to key statutory terms such as labeling and intended use. We have not asked for, and we do not want, a healthcare system in which manufacturers can market their products based on spurious or unsubstantiated claims of safety or efficacy. Third, legislation could dramatically improve the regulatory scheme. Although the MIWG has been dedicated to direct engagement with FDA on manufacturer communication issues since 2006, we also recognize the paramount role of Congress, and we believe that legislation may be necessary for several reasons. For one thing, FDA action has been slow and ineffectual. It has been almost 6 years, for example, since FDA published a notice in the Federal Register asking for comment on scientific exchange and responses to unsolicited requests. Where FDA has taken action, the policy has tacked in the wrong direction, becoming less clear and even more speech restrictive. For these reasons, it would be helpful for Congress to step in and set the overall policy direction for FDA to implement. Legislation is also more durable than unilateral FDA action. Statutory law is not subject to the same variability as agency pronouncements and cannot be undone in a future administration. Legislation would be less susceptible to legal challenge than a regulation or an FDA guidance document. Regulations have the force of law, but the Administrative Procedure Act creates a vehicle for challenge in court, whereas a statutory change could only be challenged successfully in court on constitutional grounds. Legislation may also be necessary given the likelihood of continued judicial involvement in this area. Although we value the contributions that recent judicial decisions have made to the body of relevant law, we also believe that litigation is not the best way to make law on important public health issues where there is little room for error. We are especially concerned that some future lawsuit might eviscerate the FDA regulatory scheme. We see great value in congressional engagement with FDA on manufacturer communication issues to help assure the regulatory scheme is put onto a more stable and sustainable footing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
We thank the gentlelady for her testimony. Ms. Charles, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Chairman Burgess, Vice Chairman Guthrie, Congressman Green, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you on issues surrounding communication and marketing of off-label uses. My name's Alta Sharrow. I'm the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law at the University of Wisconsin. I'm an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine, formerly known as the Institute of Medicine, where I've served on a number of committees, including the one that produced a report on ensuring the safety of the U.S. drug system. I also served as an advisor in the Office of the Commissioner at FDA from 2009 to 2011, but I'd like to note for the record that I speak for myself only and not for FDA and not for the National Academies. There are two possible reasons to expand communication about off-label uses. One is to ensure that the law is consistent with the requirements of the First Amendment. The other is to protect public health by increasing patient access to safe and effective drugs, and I share those two goals. I don't, however, believe that the two amendments under discussion are necessary to achieve those goals. Indeed, I fear the unintended consequence of adopting the language in these amendments would be to undermine public health, to discourage pharmaceutical research, and to set pharmaceutical regulation back by more than 100 years. As noted in an article I co-authored with Josh Sharfstein, formerly the principal deputy at FDA, our drug regulation system has prohibited false and misleading advertising since 1906. And in 1962, broad marketing for secondary uses of thalidomide caused thousands of severe birth defects worldwide. And Congress then recognized that a product can be safe and effective for one intended use where the benefits exceed the risks, but not safe and effective for another, which is why approval of a drug for a labeled indication does not mean it will be safe and effective for off-label uses, and precisely why additional studies are needed. Now, this requirement to demonstrate safety and effectiveness for an intended use applies both to the first approval of a new compound or a new drug, as well as to any supplemental indication. And while it's true there have been a handful of cases that have narrowed narrowing constraints on commercial speech regarding unapproved off-label uses, The courts have consistently upheld commercial speech restriction with respect to the first approval of a new product. If the First Amendment means that off-label promotion must be permitted, then promotion of entirely untested, never approved drugs should also garner the same protection. In both cases, the majority of drugs will fail to show that they are safe and effective when the testing has been completed. And the substantial public interest in achieving that certainty is the same, regardless of whether it is an entirely new drug or a supplemental indication for an existing drug. If we were to eliminate the restrictions on commercial speech for entirely unapproved drugs, it would return us to the 1906 law, where prosecution for false and misleading marketing took place only after people had been harmed. Scientific journals and conferences are already allowed to present information about off-label uses. Sponsors can answer questions from physicians and provide reprints of peer-reviewed articles, even if related to off-label uses. And in April 2017, the FDA further clarified these rules and used guidances as a more flexible mechanism to provide that information. Legislation, regulation, and court decisions have not the kind of flexibility that guidances have. We've entered an era in which communication takes on many new forms, ranging from tweets to Facebook to any number of internet sources, and it is important to maintain flexibility in how we regard communication and its influence and its intended purpose, rather than solidifying it in legislation, which can be difficult to change over time. Now, the proposed amendment of Section 201 muddies the exceptions that FDA has outlined, and I fear it risks eviscerating the general rule against off-label promotion, even if that is not its intent. It also has the effect of immunizing sponsors from responsibility, even if they know and take advantage of the now blurry line between legitimate scientific exchange and illegal marketing. The proposed amendment of Section 502, I fear, will exacerbate this problem by allowing premature information to be delivered to formularies and payers, with the probable effect of increasing patient use of unproven and unsafe therapies. And as has been noted already by members here on the committee, studies have repeatedly shown that even products that look promising in early trials will usually be shown to be unsafe or ineffective when larger trials are completed. And indeed, overall, only 1 in 5 compounds, only 1 in 5, will successfully move from phase 2 to phase 3 trial, with lack of efficacy as the most common reason for failure. In a series of articles recently produced by Professor Christopher Robinson at the University of Arizona, we can also see that multiple studies show that the majority of off-label uses also will turn out to be either unsafe or ineffective. Encouraging coverage before approval is to encourage expanded use before approval of treatments that we now know empirically are likely to fail. And I fear that the effect would be to increase use that will harm more patients than it helps. History amply demonstrates there's a compelling public interest in unbiased evaluation of evidence, in clear, accurate communication, in maintaining incentives for research. The combined effect of these amendments is to expand promotion and payment for unproven uses of drugs. It undercuts the marketing advantages that the law now uses as an incentive for sponsors to complete the research needed to see which uses are in fact safe and effective. And in turn, it leaves physicians, patients, formularies, and payers without independently verified information. For complex products like drugs, the marketplace of ideas cannot work properly with unvetted information from necessarily self-interested sources. And when using the wrong drug can injure patients or cause them to miss out on an effective treatment, it's an invitation to another tragedy when we prevent FDA from doing its job to protect the public. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Chair recognizes Dr. Van Hare. 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Good morning, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this hearing and for inviting me to testify on this important topic. My name is George Van Hare. I am Chief of Pediatric Cardiology at St. Louis Children's Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. My clinical practice is focused on caring for children with heart rhythm disorders. This year, I have the honor of serving as the president of the Heart Rhythm Society. The Heart Rhythm Society is the international leader in science education and advocacy for cardiac arrhythmia professionals. Its members include 6,100 physicians, scientists, nurses, and other allied health professionals in more than 90 countries. Sharing comprehensive, scientifically valid data is critical to the practice of medicine generally, and it is even more critical for particular specialties. It is sometimes claimed that the use of drugs or devices off-label is a result of a choice by physicians. Sometimes this is true. However, for pediatric subspecialists, this is usually not the case. This is due to the fact that very few of the medications for arrhythmias that are on the market are formally approved for use in children. Thus, using treatments off-label is often our main method of treatment of children. Similarly, catheters that we use for catheter ablation procedures are labeled for a limited number of specific arrhythmias, but are used for treating and curing all types of arrhythmias in adults and children. By way of example, I would like to cite a specific drug, amiodarone, brand name Cordarone. This is one of our most important medications for the treatment of potentially life-threatening arrhythmias, particularly in patients who have undergone successful surgical repair of complex congenital heart defects. The FDA-approved label simply states the safety and efficacy of Cordarone tablets in pediatric patients have not been established. This means that the manufacturer is not allowed to share prospectively any data that they may have concerning experience with this drug in children. Another example, not specific to children, is a labeling of ablation catheters. These devices are used in performing catheterization procedures to cure arrhythmias. In the last 25 years, these procedures have essentially replaced open heart surgery as the best option for a curative procedure. Their labeling is limited to only certain arrhythmias. For example, the CryoCath, a cryoablation catheter manufactured by Medtronic, is only labeled for treating one common arrhythmia, AVNRT, despite the fact that it is ideal for treating other, more dangerous arrhythmias. It would be absurd to use a different catheter for these other arrhythmias on the basis of the labeling, and even more absurd to consider open heart surgery. However, because of the labeling, technical support representatives of the manufacturer are not allowed to discuss other indications directly and prospectively, despite the fact that the use of this catheter for these other indications is widely agreed to be the standard of care. There is an important way in which information sharing among physicians may also be adversely affected. When a medical conference is directly sponsored by a manufacturer, these conferences do not qualify as official continuing medical education events. Consequently, physician speakers are considered to be agents of the manufacturer sponsoring the event, and they are also limited to discussing only the labeled indications. Any discussion between physicians regarding experiences with drugs or devices that are off-label at such events must occur informally rather than as part of the program, and thus these discussions do not benefit from the great potential for information sharing among physician attendees. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. It is likely that there is a large amount of data maintained by manufacturers, which, under the current rules, they are not allowed to proactively share with clinicians. I urge the committee to explore ways to define acceptable types of real-world evidence that manufacturers might proactively share with medical decision makers. These types of data might include observational studies, pharmacokinetic studies, and information on particular subpopulations. The data must be truthful, presented in context, and scientifically valid. There is some concern that manufacturers might overwhelm physicians with data taken out of context or data that are misleading and skewed to present a more favorable picture than is realistic. However, physicians are trained to analyze data. We know how to evaluate the validity of studies. If regulatory restrictions provide guardrails to ensure that data are truthful and presented in context, physicians are fully capable of analyzing such data effectively. In my opinion, a reasonable regulatory paradigm lies somewhere between no communication and completely unrestricted communication. The current structure is not optimal for fostering the advancement of medical knowledge, and it leaves many patients and their physicians at an unnecessary disadvantage. Additionally, it seems incongruous to me that the manufacturer, the entity with the most robust data related to a product, cannot share information they hold proactively, while any layperson with an internet connection can freely disseminate whatever information they like about that same product, however biased and unreliable. In closing, I hope that my testimony has provided the committee with a real-world perspective on how the current rules often prevent physicians from receiving valuable clinical information in a timely fashion. I respectfully suggest that Congress establish ways to unlock data maintained by manufacturers related to off-label use of drugs and devices. I thank the committee for its time. The Heart Rhythm Society would welcome the opportunity to work with you on policy proposals related to this topic. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman for his testimony. Dr. Kesselheim, you're recognized for 5 minutes for a statement, please.
Good morning, and Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. In my time, I want to make 4 main points. First, the current restrictions on manufacturers' ability to market their drugs for non-FDA-approved indications is not a bureaucratic or paternalistic effort to prevent manufacturers from communicating. These rules were developed in response to major public health problems caused by the lack of such regulation. Evidence of the public health dangers that arise from widespread off-label marketing can be seen in the drug paroxetine, or Paxil, an antidepressant that was promoted off-label for use in children, leading to, at its peak, over 2 million prescriptions per year for use in children, until it was ultimately linked to self-injury and suicide in that population. Or the off-label promotion of antipsychotic medications to control behavioral symptoms in elderly patients with dementia, uses that are not only generally ineffective, but that also increase the risk of death by 60 to 70%. At one point, due to off-label promotion, approximately 1 in 7 elderly nursing home residents reportedly received these drugs. Over and over again, these episodes show us, as former Chief Justice William Rehnquist originally put it, that there are sufficient dangers attending the widespread use of pharmaceuticals that they simply may not be promoted in the same manner as hair creams, deodorants, and toothpaste. Second, the dangers from off-label promotion do not come simply from the spread of false information about these products, although that does happen on occasion, of course. Rather, in one study that I led, we found that off-label promotion most commonly involved presenting reports of individual cases or poorly designed studies as definitive evidence supporting an off-label use, while de-emphasizing data that didn't fit the narrative the manufacturers were creating. In each of these particular cases, the words themselves may not have been false or strictly misleading, but the benefits of the drug overstated and the risks downplayed in ways that the physicians might have needed advanced training in epidemiology or access to the underlying clinical trial data to understand, which they simply do not have. This is why we need the diligent, independent assessment of safety and efficacy provided by the FDA. The complexity of the assessment that's required, along with the high stakes of getting that assessment wrong, provides the rationale for having a formal drug approval process in the first place. Third, the Griffith and Guthrie discussion drafts directly risk these outcomes. The Guthrie discussion draft, for example, defines scientific information that could support an off-label marketing claim as including preclinical data in petri dishes or in mice, and all it requires is a study that was conducted that the manufacturer anticipates could be sufficient to support FDA approval. The Griffith draft, in creating a so-called safe harbor for scientific exchange, purports to require manufacturers to disclose appropriate contextual information for their statements. But it would be highly risky to give a manufacturer with a strong financial and intellectual stake in the product's success free rein to determine what is or isn't proper context, or what is or isn't contradictory for its product. At the same time, it's unrealistic to expect each individual physician to have the time and expertise to subject such claims to the same kind of scrutiny that the FDA would exercise when it reviews a drug application or a request for a new indication. The drafts also purport to protect the public health by attaching disclaimers to these off-label communications. But I led a systematic review of the evidence about the impact of such disclaimers, most of which currently come in the context of promotional statements for herbal remedies and dietary supplements, for which Congress eliminated FDA oversight of promotion more than 20 years ago. Many of these products advertise health-enhancing effects despite no legitimate evidence that they work, with disclaimers that the FDA has not evaluated the promotional claims, but the massive collective evidence reveals that such disclaimers fail to adequately inform or modify consumer behavior. So when anybody proposes a disclaimer, I suggest that there be a disclaimer, that disclaimers don't actually work. Finally, I want to emphasize that the current system helps protect patients from widespread promotion of drugs and devices for potentially unsafe and ineffective off-label uses, while still permitting off-label prescribing at the discretion of physician and patients and providing well-circumscribed avenues for manufacturer communication about these issues, such as in response to bona fide questions arising from physicians. By contrast, the Griffith and Guthrie discussion drafts would reduce manufacturers' incentives to conduct well-controlled trials of potential off-label uses in the first place. Instead, as Representative Green mentioned, manufacturers would be incentivized to seek approval of drugs and devices for the narrowest indication possible and then conduct studies of variable quality showing the utility of these products for unapproved indications that would not meet current FDA standards for scientific rigor. I strongly recommend that the committee not pursue these drafts and instead consider how we can give the FDA the proper resources and authorities to continue to review emerging data efficiently so that evidence that does support new uses of drugs and devices can be incorporated into their labels and clinical practice, while uses that the totality of the data show are unsafe can be identified for the benefits of patients. Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Ms. House, you're recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Good morning. My name is Linda House, and I'm the president of the Cancer Support Community. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing us to be here and share this testimony today. The Cancer Support Community is an international nonprofit organization whose mission is to ensure that all people impacted by cancer are empowered by knowledge, strengthened by action, and sustained by community. Our organization sees over 100,000 patients and families each year through a network of affiliates around the world. We also have a cancer support helpline where we administer through both of those properties over $50 million of evidence-based care and support each year free of charge to the patients and their families. Importantly, CSC is also home to the only research and training institute of its kind, whose mission is to collect and analyze information from patients to elevate the voice of the patient and the caregiver as it relates to their cancer experience. I'm here today to bring you what I feel is the most important voice to this conversation, and that is the voice of the patient. The last 20 years have delivered unprecedented growth in innovation across all aspects of healthcare. Never before has a patient had so many options for diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up care as they do now. Patients are more educated, they're more engaged, they're more empowered consumers of healthcare than ever before. Yet despite the emergence of patients as important players and even leaders of their care teams, accessibility to comprehensive information continues to be elusive. We will be releasing data next week from our Cancer Experience Registry, where we've learned that 50% of patients engage in shared treatment decision-making with their healthcare professionals. Only about 8% report allowing healthcare professionals to make decisions without their input. Yet only 25% indicate that they feel like they're prepared to have those treatment decisions. Importantly, our data reflects a growing concern about inadequate collection, reporting, and label updating of endpoints that are meaningful to patients. In our research, 93% of respondents considered quality of life as very important when making treatment decisions. Quality of life measured higher than length of life, and these are people with cancer. Yet product labels continue to focus very little on fully measuring comprehensive quality of life metrics. Further, product labels almost never reflect updates when there are findings beyond the clinical trial setting, including findings about long-term effects, which would be meaningful for patients. A system that does not proactively collect, publish, and share data poses a significant risk to patient care. There are a few issues I'd like to raise as current limitations. And we do support the work that the FDA does, and we do support the work of the clinical trials systems, and we do support accurate, meaningful, non-promotional communication. Pre-approval information, as you know, is when clinical data is available on a product prior to the product having an FDA label. According to Pharma, it takes an average of 10 to 15 years for a drug to make it to market. And during that time, much is learned about the way in which the drug works in the body, how the body works with the drug. What is the accurate dose? What is the toxic dose? And what are the side effects associated with that drug? Yet this treasure trove of information remains out of reach from individuals other than the sponsor or potential trial investigators. Number two, limiting communication of information to only that which is reflected in the label poses a significant challenge to patients. CSC appreciates the work of the FDA and sponsors of the Phase 4 studies in particular, but recognizes that these studies do not capture comprehensive data for the use of the product, as was mentioned, in the real world. Also, it's a rare occurrence for the label to be updated in a manner that would allow for proactive communications of findings outside of the controlled clinical trial setting. And as we know, once trials go into broader, less controlled situations, they perform differently in those patients. Number three, data accumulated through investigator-initiated trials on diseases that would never reach the investment potential for a registration and a label is extremely important to clinical care. This information may never be communicated to clinicians and will almost certainly not be made available to patients who may benefit from the findings, and this is particularly important in patients with rare disease. Number four, information learned outside of the clinical trial setting and not captured in the label can also have a true impact on the patient experience. And as I've submitted in my written testimony, this could be things like burning at the injection site, a reduction in fatigue by understanding how to better supplement the treatments. That information is not in the label and cannot be shared in a proactive way. Number three, there are several elements in general clinical practice that are continuing to contribute to the limitation that patients have to access comprehensive medical information through their healthcare team. And in particular, as there is an active evolution of the care delivery systems from volume to value, it has brought with it efficiency and cost containment strategies that focus on limiting treatment decisions. And I'm talking about hospital-based formularies and clinical pathways that are currently being used in physician practices. Number 6, there's an inconsistent practice and reinforcement of publishing clinical trial data results in scientific journals and other databases. This information has to be published, and as mentioned in my written comments, the ratio of trials that have been opened, closed, and published, the compliance rate with that is abysmal. And there must not only be requirements, but also enforcement of the requirements to ensure that all results of trials be posted, whether those results are positive or negative. Finally, industry interpretation of the current regulations is applied inconsistently across companies. This impacts the way in which industry communicates with all stakeholders, and most certainly the way in which industry communicates with patients and families, forcing them only through the direct-to-consumer marketing channel. So in conclusion, while the comments that I've made have simply scratched the surface on what is a much broader and deeper issue, it's my hope that I've highlighted in your mind the perspective of patients who are living with chronic and life-threatening illnesses across the United States. And to summarize some specific areas where we would like to continue to work with the committee and the FDA, patients and healthcare providers must have access to medical research finding in a comprehensive and real-time manner. Product labels should be updated in a timely manner and include data from endpoints that matter most to patients. And/or there must be another mechanism by which to capture and proactively communicate findings that are clinically meaningful and relevant. Scientifically sound communications about safe and effective uses of a product are essential and should be made available to all stakeholders. Clinical trial results, both positive and negative, should be published by the trial sponsor in a period of time that is reasonable to allow full and meaningful data review while ensuring timely access to information. Data, positive and negative, collected outside the clinical trial process, inclusive of real-world evidence that's collected and analyzed with appropriate scientific rigor, should be published and made available to stakeholders. And finally, proactive medical communication should be tailored to meet the needs and literacy levels of specific stakeholders and should not, for any stakeholder, be limited only to the product label, which may not yet exist or may be outdated. Thank you for allowing us to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Khatchatorian, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you to Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green, and members of the Subcommittee on Health for providing me the opportunity to speak before you today. I am Catherine Khatchatorian, a pharmacist working in Medicare health insurance and a member of the AMCP Professional Practice Committee. Imagine a world where you are required by federal and state laws to determine a budget and coverage criteria for all drugs 8 to 12 months in advance of the coverage year, using limited available information while knowing there's information that could help you make more accurate and informed decisions. You just don't have the key to unlock the consistent release of that information. This is the world we live in as payers and population health decision makers. The limitations on information we are able to obtain results in a hindrance to patient access to novel and emerging therapies, limits our ability to accurately forecast, plan, and budget for anticipated expenditures, and it precludes our ability to contract on value rather than volume. This is the reason I'm here before you today, to demonstrate the need for a legislative framework in support of House Bill 2026, which will provide the key to unlock additional information needed for us to make informed benefit decisions for better patient access to treatments. These concepts have been discussed in depth with a diverse group of stakeholders, including payers, manufacturers, clinicians, and patient advocacy groups who arrived at consensus recommendations for how, who, and what information should be exchanged prior to FDA approval. This information should be limited to a narrow audience, inclusive of payers and population health decision makers. This scope does not include manufacturer communications with patients or prescribers prior to FDA approval. Let me share a few personal examples where lack of information has decreased patients' timely access to treatment. In December of 2013 and October of 2014, the FDA approved breakthrough treatments for the treatment of hepatitis C. These drugs had novel mechanisms of action, which changed the landscape for patients with this diagnosis. Note, these approval dates were several months after we had already, or many payers had already analyzed costs and plan benefits. Had we been able to discuss in advance of the approval of these treatments, we would have had a better understanding of the landscape, timeline of approval of multiple products, the relevant patients for each treatment, and any clinical information that would help us to make better decisions and ultimately been able to treat more patients in a more effective manner without the subsequent criteria revisions that proceeded after the approval of these products. More importantly, the lack of needed information can impede patient access, as seen in the new treatments for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. In this instance, the level of evidence required to deem products safe and effective met the requirements for FDA approval. However, due to the inability of payers and manufacturers to openly discuss the level of evidence required for coverage, payers are not covering these therapies at this time. This is why the bidirectional information exchange is important to understand the level of evidence available and necessary for coverage. This example has left patients in a situation where they cannot access therapy. Had payers been able to convey the level of evidence required for coverage, could we have avoided this situation? Perhaps. Another patient access issue was one I experienced in the past year for a request for oncology. On September 1st, 2016, we received a coverage request for treatment of a patient diagnosed with inoperable lip cancer that had recently spread to their tongue. The FDA granted accelerated approval to expand the indications of an existing chemotherapy treatment on August 5th, 2016, to include head and neck cancer. However, when we received the request for coverage, the labeled indications and data supporting the expanded indication were not publicly available. In this situation, had I had the ability to discuss the data in advance with the manufacturer, I could have been better prepared to discuss the requested treatment with the provider rather than scrambling through clinicaltrials.gov and requesting a copy of the clinical trial from the manufacturer while the insured patient awaited my coverage decision. Because we can only estimate when therapies will be approved, if we receive a coverage request shortly after FDA approval, the landscape still remains one of chaos and special requests to manufacturers until the data is published, compendia and guidelines are updated, and coverage criteria reflect these new and novel treatments. As demonstrated in the previous examples, each of these breakthrough therapies represent innovation and the potential to change a patient's life if they're able to gain access to treatment. The barrier to access to novel therapies is a population health decision maker's ability to have sufficient data and sophisticated discussions with those most informed about the utility of the products in a timely enough fashion to budget, plan, and forecast for the therapies coming to market. In conclusion, this is an issue of great importance for patient access to emerging therapies, where a diverse group of stakeholders have come together to develop consensus recommendations. This includes a very narrow audience and scope of exchange between manufacturers and payers only. We need your legislative support to better care for our patients. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for your testimony. I want to thank all of our witnesses. It's certainly been compelling testimony this morning. People will note that I allowed the clock to run over because you had important information to provide us. I just will underscore that I will not be so generous with members. So try to confine your time to the 5 minutes allotted, and these products have not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose or prevent any condition, just to give the appropriate label disclaimer. Let me begin the questioning. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And Ms. House and Ms. Kachatorian, thank you so much for your testimony. Ms. House, while you were talking, and I actually wrote down a note to myself about when you mentioned about clinical trials, and I was going to ask you about the utility of getting the information off clinicaltrials.gov, and then Ms. Kachatorian actually referenced that as well. So this is a real world phenomenon where payer decisions are unable to be made, but the data's sort of accumulating on the data side of the docket, but it's not coming out to the payer side. So it sounds like both of you have dealt with that, and Ms. Kachatorian, I thank you for bringing up the issue with the new hepatitis C drugs, because we were sitting on these panels in 2012 and 2013. And I would suggest it's not just an issue of commercial payers. Our state Medicaid directors, our state prison directors, our federal prison directors, were going to have to deal with this information in very short order, and they did not have it available to them. And I'd be happy to listen to what both of you have to say, particularly on the clinicaltrials.gov. Are we doing a good enough job getting that information out there in a usable way so that you can actually begin the process of what are we going to have to do as far as the on the payer's side? And Ms. House, let me start with you, and then I'd like to hear Ms. Kacharian's thoughts on that.
Thank you. What I didn't share in my comments, but I have in my written testimony, I included 2 studies that were done on the clinicaltrials.gov database, where there was a random sampling of 600 trials originally, and 50% of those trials did not have a corresponding article. The second study was even more alarming in that there was a look at 13,327 trials, and 1 year post-data closure, only 13% of those had posted clinical trials information. And even when they gave a bit of a grace period and extended that for another couple of years, only 38% had clinical trial posted there. So not only is the system extremely difficult to sort of use and find, and especially as we're moving into the age of personalized medicine, just get to trials that are relevant for me, the data results aren't there. And I'll give you an example that happened to me just last week, is that a patient of ours reached out, and he has a certain type of lung cancer, ALK-positive lung cancer, for which there are a number of solutions and options available for him. His physician wanted to put him on a phase 2 trial with a new product, and he said, "What do you think about this?" And so I went online to try to find information, because I was trying to decide why were they putting him on the phase 2 trial instead of the phase 3 trial. And I'm an educated consumer, and I've worked in clinical trials for a long time. After about an hour and a half, I could find 2 sources online, to your point. One of them was with a reputable medical society, and the other was an opinion piece on the way in which this product worked. Yet they're in a phase 3 setting already, so there's a lot of evidence on this particular drug not available to even educated consumers.
Great. Ms. Kacharian?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Burgess. And I actually pulled some dates more relevant to some recently approved therapies. In the hepatitis space, the products Zepatier and Epiclusa were approved January 28th, 2016 and June 28th, 2016 per the FDA website. However, results on clinicaltrials.gov were not published until September 27th, 2016 and April 26th, 2017, respectively. So just to give perspective regarding when data is available and results are published, those are key dates that I was able to glean. I have some oncology examples as well, but I think that proves the point regarding the delay in access to information that is necessary for coverage decisions.
So, Dr. Van Heer, you referenced the rich data sets that would be available by a drug or device manufacturer, but that data is sort of locked away from the clinician. I guess you have to go to the bar to have those discussions. You can't have those discussions in the hearing room or the continuing education room. You have to go off-site.
Or the stairwell, yeah.
Or the stairwell, okay, very well. And you see what we're talking about today as a way of unlocking those data sets to be available to the clinicians?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's, really pretty simple. If we're allowing off-label use, physician who prescribes something off-label is responsible for ensuring that they that they've evaluated the most appropriate clinical data before they make their decision about prescribing something off-label, and some of that data is actually held by the manufacturers. They're allowed, as I understand it, to provide it to us privately and in response to an unsolicited request. But there's 300 of me in the country, 300 pediatric cardiologists who do what I do in the country, and every single one of us has to independently call up the drug company to get the information. It's not particularly efficient.
No. My time has expired. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Mr. Green, you're recognized for 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Long ago, Congress recognized the importance of requiring manufacturers to provide evidence demonstrating the safety and efficiency of the product and marketing. Under current law, drug and medical device manufacturers can disseminate certain medical scientific information about unapproved uses of approved or cleared products in healthcare professionals to healthcare professionals and other entities. Recent court cases cite it as a source of uncertainty around the types of communication about these unapproved uses are permissible. Ms. Charo, in your written testimony, you said that if the First Amendment means that the off-label promotion must be permitted, then the promotion of entirely untested, unproved drugs should also garner the same protection. Is that true?
I fear that the logic would be the same in both cases. Now, it's true that for things that have been approved at least once, one does have some, at least, early information that the drug is not highly toxic, because that we're going to get from the early phase 1 or 2 trials. But the reality is, over time, both the drugs that have never been approved before or the off-label indications for things that have been approved turn out to fail, which means that one begins with the presumption that any unapproved use or any unapproved drug is probably not safe or not effective until it's proven to be so.
Okay. Well, this is an issue that this subcommittee and our committee has wrestled with for a number of years. Can you help us understand what restrictions the Constitution does and does not allow? Does the First Amendment prohibit the FDA from restricting promotion of unapproved uses?
No, there are a number of federal cases that have upheld the FDA's authority to do just that. There is constitutional protection for commercial speech, and there are standards for that protection. And in the area of commercial speech, it's a fair amount of protection, although not the same degree of protection as you would get for political speech or other forms of speech. And those restrictions on commercial speech are permitted when there is a substantial public interest in doing so. In this case, by restricting off-label promotion, one is able to create both a stick and a carrot that drives the pharmaceutical industry toward the research needed to actually figure out which things are safe and which things are effective. If one is able to simply promote without restriction and gets no market advantage by going and investing in the research, one loses that system entirely. And we really do risk having an absence of information for people like Dr. Van Hare to solicit or to develop on his own, let alone to share with his colleagues.
Ms. House, I noted in your focus on your testimony the fact that so much clinical trial data is unpublished. One thing that concerns me is the bias in what is published. Multiple studies have shown that positive trial results are more likely to be published than negative results. And in particular, industry sponsorship have been demonstrated to be a factor contributing to the biased publication. Industry has no incentive to publish or promote negative findings. My question is, if...
You know, scientific research is often somewhat equivocal for a very long time. And I think what we're discussing here is really what to do in that interim period where the evidence is shifting around. Do we presume everything is going to work and therefore everything people want to say is likely to be true and should be allowed? Or are we going to presume that it probably isn't going to work out and we should restrain the speech until we've actually proved it will? From my perspective, given that the risk of incorrect information is that people will actually be harmed, or they won't go for the effective treatment, they'll go for the ineffective one, we need to err on the side of caution here and protect the larger population. That said, there are certainly going to be some occasions in which it turns out that something does work, and it would have been wonderful if we could have seen it earlier and talked about it earlier. But those incidents will be fewer than those in which it would be damaging.
In the last 30 seconds, Dr. Kesselheim, what does history tell us about off-label promotion? Are there some things we should be recognizing here?
Sure. I mean, over and over and over again throughout history, and this isn't even, you don't even have to go back to the thalidomides and of 50 years ago. You can, in more recent history, tells us that that off-label promotion drives physician practices in ways that favor the drug being promoted, not in ways that favor the overall state of the evidence and the overall state of practice. And I think that we need to be very wary about efforts to try to expand that promotion when it covers non-evidence-based, potentially non-evidence-based communications.
I think we need to, when it comes to patient access, discuss more about the cost. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks. The Gentlelady Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me state that I don't believe any of the testimony has been disingenuous in my judgment. This is a very difficult issue, and we're trying to balance the equities on this committee, and I am pleased that every member of the panel is here, and I do not question the integrity of any member of the panel. Councillor Klassmeyer, do you believe that the standard will be strict scrutiny, or will it be rational basis, or will it be some intermediate standard, based upon your professional judgment as a distinguished member of the bar?
Congressman, my judgment is that the standard will be some variation of intermediate scrutiny.
Intermediate scrutiny, yes.
And it will be most likely the Central Hudson standard with a garnish of heightened scrutiny as a result of the Supreme Court's decision in Sorrell in 2011.
Yes, that's my judgment as well, and I think that there is a history of decisions in this regard that would indicate that that is probably where we will be eventually as a matter of legal analysis. Thank you. Dr. Van Heer, we have all heard that some off-label uses are well established in clinical practice and supported by high-quality evidence and are the standard of cure for many conditions. From your perspective, based upon your distinguished history, how does the pieces of legislation before this committee stand to improve care for patients?
Well, to the extent that the legislation proposed by Congressman Griffith allows or improves the efficiency of sharing data that the device companies and pharmaceutical companies actually have for physicians who are prescribing off-label, I think it will actually help.
Thank you, and other members of the panel are certainly welcome to comment. Dr. Khatchatorian, what are the odds that if we pass legislation we are considering today, sophisticated population health decision makers like payers, provider-sponsored health plans, pharmacy benefit managers, and other organizations would be misled by unscrupulous drug and device manufacturers who make unfounded claims about their products?
So first, let me acknowledge my testimony was by no means disingenuous.
I'm sure, and that is why I raised it. And if I might interrupt you, I tried to lead by example in the Congress, both on the floor and in committee, and I enjoy the testimony of every witness who comes before us, and those who know me know that disingenuous is not a word that I find attractive in vocabulary here on Capitol Hill. Yes, please continue.
Thank you. So population health decision makers and clinicians that we are discussing here are well trained to look at things with scrutiny and to determine what level of evidence is acceptable. And during the multi-stakeholder discussions that we've had, we did address the need to determine a level of evidence and to have an agreement on what is acceptable and non-misleading. And as evidence continues to evolve and as new therapies continue to emerge, that is the goal, is to develop strict criteria that will be used to apply to any level of evidence in order to ensure that it is high level and with the patient's best interest in mind.
Certainly, and that is what we are attempting to get to a place where we can make sure that always there is the greatest standard of care. It is the jurisdiction of the subcommittee and ultimately of the full committee to promote the better health of the American nation, and we recognize this is a difficult issue, and I certainly commend my colleagues, including the gentleman to my immediate right, the distinguished member from Virginia, as we undertake an analysis of how best to protect the American people, recognizing that that is the goal of this subcommittee in a bipartisan nature. I yield back 22 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
And the chair thanks the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from California. 5 minutes for questions, please. Ms. Matsui.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This committee recognizes the important role that FDA plays to ensure public health and safety, as evidenced by the bipartisan user fee reauthorization that we intend to pass out of the House this afternoon. Now, we can't tolerate efforts to jeopardize that role as patients across the America who take drugs to treat or cure conditions rely upon the FDA to monitor the safety of these drugs and devices. I'm really glad that we're holding this hearing today to examine issues that arise around information sharing, particularly for those so-called off-label use, and what could be done to alleviate those issues without detracting from FDA's ability to regulate safety. I'm particularly interested in the situation that many rare disease and cancer patients find themselves in. As many as 1 in 5 prescriptions are written for drugs off-label, meaning that they're prescribed for a condition or population that has not been FDA approved as safe and effective. Oftentimes, off-label drugs are the only treatment available and even the standard of care for rare disease patients with limited options. Ms. House, thank you very much for your advocacy on behalf of cancer patients. Can you please discuss the prevalence of off-label use in cancer patients?
So there was a position posted by the Friends of Cancer Research just yesterday that indicated that the use in cancer off-label was close to 80%. And one of the problems that I just wanted to raise as I was listening to some other discussion is, I'm going to give you an example. It's an older example, but it really talks about how the current labels are out of date. There was a time around 2000 where this is the time prior to personalized medicine, so it was still in the era of poisons for cancer, that there was a combination being used off-label as standard of care for the treatment of lung cancer. That particular combination failed at that time 13 phase 3 trials, which is the gold standard for the evaluation for the FDA, yet it continued to be used standard of care for many, many, many years beyond that. This morning, I went on the FDA website and pulled up the label for one of the lead drug in that, and it today, in 2017, still has not been updated to reflect the use of that combination.
Oh, wow.
Which is a problem.
It is a problem, right. Now, you know, when a family gets a cancer diagnosis, I think the world stops. And you're sort of grasping at what can we do? So, and I think we all go to, you know, the internet. That's where we go right now. What types of information is generally available to patients and their providers when a drug is used off-label? And if you're even when you're an educated consumer, you really kind of hit a brick wall. What kinds of solutions might you recommend to address these challenges?
Yeah. So I think creating solutions that, again, are tailored to the stakeholder, to their literacy level, to their educational level. There's really no reason why we can't create forums that would be peer-reviewed, scientifically sound analysis and presentation of clinical data. What it does prevent then is people going to the internet and getting onto a chat room that may be facilitated out of another country or by somebody who has absolutely no medical background. And we see that happening all the time. And furthermore, if a patient calls a pharmaceutical company and says, I am a patient, can you give me information about XYZ? The response will almost uniformly be, I cannot answer your question. You'll have to go speak with your doctor to get that answer.
Thank you very much. Ms. Charles, I know you have concerns about the legislation that we're discussing today. Are there ways that we can refine the legislation to reach our shared goal of promoting public safety by increasing patient access to safe and effective drugs? I think there is information out there. And, you know, we're in a time now where there's much more research and innovation, and I would hate to just have a hard and fast rule regarding this.
Thank you. I completely agree with you that there are other avenues that need to be explored. For one thing, it may make sense to try to distinguish those areas where off-label use really is a necessary and important part of medical care, as we just heard in the area of cancer, and some other areas where it really is not as prevalent and is not as needed. And I would suggest that pediatrics may be another good example. And the Congress has made great strides in trying to create new systems for both incentives and even possibly rewards for continuing the necessary research to find what really is safe and effective, for example, in the pediatric population. Working on making sure that there is a proper incentive and reward to fill in the gaps in those areas would be a good step forward and might accomplish many of these goals without some of the risks that are attendant upon some of the ambiguities in what constitutes promotional marketing or what constitutes accurate information.
Okay, well, thank you. I've run out of time. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Dr. Bouchon, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was a practicing cardiothoracic surgeon prior to coming to Congress. And I'm just going to have a comment, not a question. But the medical community is relatively small. I think Dr. Van Hare said there's 300 pediatric cardiologists. There's about 4,500 to 5,000 cardiac surgeons. Information travels quickly. Physicians are always looking for better ways or effective ways to treat their patients, whether it's on-label or off-label, and information passes quickly. Frustration with labeling can be really high amongst different physician communities because of the delay in updating what may or may not be FDA approved. Patients are desperate and are getting information potentially from incorrect sources, including the internet, as has been pointed out. And so I would suggest that we definitely need reform so that patients have the opportunity to get more accurate information. With that, I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Griffith.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it greatly. Let me first say that I appreciate everybody being here today and appreciate all of your testimony. And I am open to continuing to work on the language to make sure that we get it right. So that's something that I would invite you all, if you have issues with the language that we currently have, please get those suggestions to us, because we want to try to do this in the best way that we can. We do believe that we need to do something on the legislative side. Also, Mr. Chairman, I have some letters in support of the bill and a draft language, and if I could have unanimous consent to introduce those into the record, I would appreciate it.
If the gentleman will share those with us, I will seek unanimous consent in a moment.
I also want to make sure that we're all working on the language that we currently have. And so what the bill says is, when we're talking about communication, if you look on page 2, it says, A, the communication is not advertising or otherwise promotional in nature. B, the communication is supported by competent and reliable scientific evidence. And then C, and this was to address some of the concerns that have been raised here today, we put this language in: the communication clearly discloses appropriate contextual information about the data presented, including information about limitations, and I probably should put numbers in front of these. 1, limitations of the data. 2, the scientific and analytical methodologies used. And 3, and I think very importantly, any contradictory data or information known to the manufacturer or sponsor. We're never going to solve all the problems if somebody's not doing what they're supposed to do, but our intent is to try to make sure that both sides are presented. I think somebody mentioned that earlier in the testimony, that both sides are presented and that the negative evidence is out there as well. And then we talk about, situations related to the rare diseases. Cancer has been mentioned today, and to children, because one of the problems you have in those situations where, in Dr. Van Hare, you touched on this, is that there may not be a sufficient number of patients to actually warrant doing a clinical study. Nothing compared with what you deal with your families, Dr. Hare, but my son, who's now 11, had 2/3 of his body covered with eczema when he was about 3 months old. I kept telling my wife, because of the history in the family, we got allergy problems, honey. We got him to an allergist. Between the cream that worked for me, that my pharmacist knew, between the steroid creams, between the antihistamines that they gave him, we were able to control that situation. We still have issues there. But for a child under the age of 2, there were no, some of that might have been on label, but most of that treatment was off label. And so I appreciated Ms. Charles saying that we ought to take a look at that, because I think those are the 2 hot button areas, but that doesn't mean we should exclude others. I was very curious too about this whole agent concept that is going on, where you can't go and tell the 300 other doctors, Dr. Hare. Could you speak on that briefly? And I've only got a minute left of this time period.
Yeah, it has to do with how CME, or continuing medical education, is defined. CME is actually a safe harbor. If I'm speaking at a conference that's sponsored by a accredited CME provider, like the Heart Rhythm Society or the American College of Cardiology or some other group, I can say whatever I want, and I can talk about off-label indications as much as I want. If I'm actually speaking at a conference that's actually sponsored by the pharmaceutical company or the manufacturer, then I basically am an agent I'm considered an agent. And
so if on the podium somebody asks you about a catheter to be used in a child that might be off-label, you could then be deemed, and the company could be deemed, that you are their agent, and then be in trouble under the current rules of the FDA. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
That's my understanding also. All right, Ms. Klassmeyer, My friend and colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, did a great job of going through the intellectual. Let's translate that into human, regular English.
Sure.
That means that if you bring that example to the courts, FDA is most likely going to lose. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree, and I would go one further. FDA did lose that case. That was the Washington Legal Foundation decision in 1998. And the upshot of that is that court found it unconstitutional for the government to purport to restrict the identity of speakers that could participate in those kinds of continuing education events that Dr. Van Heer describes.
Thank you very much. I yield back to my colleague. Thank you.
I yield back.
Did the gentleman had a unanimous consent request, and I sought counsel from the other side of the dais. So without objection, so ordered, if that unanimous consent request still stands.
It does, and I apologize. I just saw my time ticking away.
Very well. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castro, 5 minutes for question.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. I think allowing drug companies and manufacturers to market their drugs and devices for unapproved uses would be very dangerous for American families, American consumers. It would reduce the incentive for them to go through FDA's approval process, and reduce the incentive to go through clinical trials that really just test whether or not a product is safe and it is effective. FDA's approval process right now is the gold standard for safety and efficacy. The FDA Commissioner, Dr. Gottlieb, has said the most important incentive to developing useful information remains the ability for companies to market drugs based on what can be proven scientifically. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule, because I've learned today and reviewing your testimony, there are safe harbors. Nevertheless, Professor Charles, some contend that we must revisit this regulation of off-label promotion, because the trend in the courts is that restrictions on off-label promotion run afoul of the First Amendment. I think this is a stretch. Does the First Amendment limit FDA's responsibility for scientific review? Does it limit FDA from restricting promotion of unapproved uses? If not, what avenues do medical product manufacturers have to communicate about such uses?
Well, we have seen some cases that have touched on these things from the fringes, but you don't actually get cases that touch on it directly. For example, in one case that's frequently cited for the suggestion that the Constitution prevents the FDA from restricting truthful speech, at issue at the time was not truthful speech, but simply off-label speech. And the FDA premised its entire case on the fact that the speaker had been discussing an off-label use and never really talked to the issue about whether or not the speaker's comments had been true. The problem here has simply been that it's really, and I hope that Mr. Griffith's staff is still around for this, the problem is that no company is going to have all the information about all the studies that are being done at that time, including those that have negative results, because of various rules about confidentiality of information. The FDA may be in possession of all the information, but not necessarily every company. And so even with the best of intentions to be conveying what they believe to be truthful and contextualized information, there's the risk that that actually is missing large areas of data that would suggest that the studies they're discussing are not in fact going to be indicative of a truly safe and effective drug at the end of the day. And this is why there really is a substantial public interest, which is one of the key elements in the restriction of speech, to the current system. And the alternatives that have been presented, unfortunately, I believe, offer risks to public health that dwarf their benefits, which is why the second prong of these tests, which has to do with whether or not the government can find an alternative way of achieving its goals, I think show that really the current system is probably the best way. Tweaking, yes, but the removal of many of these restrictions, I don't believe, is necessary in order to meet the Constitution.
And there seems to be debate on whether the Griffith proposal would restrict scientific exchange under the safe harbor. What is your view of this and the Griffith discussion draft?
You know, I think that the text does attempt to isolate what is non-promotional and protect that while continuing to prohibit promotional language. I think that the difficulty here is that the very notion of what is promotional is actually somewhat ambiguous. We now know, for example, that it's possible to tweak how various results come up on the internet, whether or not it's the first, second, or third thing you see on the page. If there's a tweaking algorithm, does that constitute promotional if all it does is raise your particular data to the front of the page? These are the kinds of subtle questions that can both make the language ambiguous despite our efforts, and also, from my perspective, suggest that it's better to have the flexible tools of guidances that can be negotiated over time with the constantly changing nature of communication, rather than the somewhat more rigid tools of regulation and legislation, let alone having courts do it 17 years after the fact and leave everybody uncertain for that long period in between.
Dr. Kesselheim, do you have a comment on this topic as well?
I also agree that the way that this discussion draft is written provides substantial leeway for companies to interpret these various provisions in ways that are favorable to their particular advertising strategy and
At the cost of public safety?
and at the cost of public safety.
Thank you. I yield back. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter. 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Certainly an important subject. Dr. Khatchatorian, you're a pharmacist, as am I. And I can tell you that after 30 years of practicing pharmacy, certainly side effects are, we call them side effects. And it's always been interesting to me why we call them side effects, because essentially they are effects of the drug, but they're not what we want it to do, so we kind of label them as side effects. But I noticed in your statement, in your testimony, in your written testimony, that you feel like the pharmaceutical information exchange would be helpful and useful, and there's some debate on whether it should be evidence-based or whether it should be information-based, and I noticed that you said that it should be based on information only, or not only, but basically. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Absolutely, thank you. So when we think about evidence, there are established criteria for evidence as far as what constitutes a clinical trial and the acceptable level of evidence for FDA approval. When I talk about information may include financial models, may include other information that does not quite meet the level of evidence that one might traditionally think. So when we talk about information, if I'm able to discuss with my clinical colleagues at a manufacturer what models might be available, what subpopulations were studied, and what level of information might be available that can help me to make more effective decisions, that's what I mean by information. And again, I will reference the multi-stakeholder forum where we discussed developing criteria that will set the foundation for what that information might entail and what level of quality of information could be deemed acceptable.
You also mentioned in your testimony that a very proactive pharmaceutical information exchange would lead to cost savings. Can you tell me if it could lead to cost savings for patients? So in that respect, how can we assure that the cost savings are going to be passed on to the patients if we don't have transparency within the prescription drug or the prescription benefit managers and the other middlemen that are included so often in these scenarios?
Sure. While cost is an aspect of evolving and emerging therapies and treatments that are coming, cost is an aspect that needs to be discussed. However, with the exchange of information, it makes us more effective in the use of the funds that we have available to make benefit decisions. So when we are structuring a benefit based on value of that's what value will be conveyed to both us as the payer as well as the patient. So ultimately, from a cost discussion, that is in turn outside of the transparency, which is a little bit of a different discussion.
I'm not sure I understand how it can be a little bit of a different discussion. Because I believe truly that it can have cost savings to the patient if we have transparency within the system. And I don't see how it can be if we don't have transparency.
So I absolutely acknowledge transparency is an important factor. However, the information exchange between a payer as well as the manufacturer will help us to make better decisions and with a limited pool of money that we are able to allocate to benefit design. We try to make the most cost-effective decisions on behalf of those patients that we serve. So in turn, the cost savings are passed to the patient as the ultimate user of our benefit design.
Okay, I'll move on. Dr. Van Heer, and thank you very much for being here, Dr. Cacciatore. Dr. Van Heer, I've seen in my practice over the years, particularly with prescription drugs, a lot of off-label uses, if you will, in pediatric patients. And I just want to get your feeling on the value of that, because I've seen it firsthand that it has been very valuable.
Yeah, well, so I would say it's essential, in fact, for most of what we do, particularly in the pediatric cardiology area. But I mean, I do think there are, we have reservations about it. When people make decisions based on, information they get from like one other colleague who used it once in some patient, that's very, very sort of limited. But I would say that certainly we have to do it. We have no choice but to do off-label prescribing in a lot of situations, and we would prefer to have the the best possible information. We also use what is known about the use of these medications in other age groups, particularly adults, or other particular conditions, and basically extend to these particular populations. And that may or may not be valid, as some other members of the panel here have talked about. But absent better data, it's all we actually have.
Great. Thank you all very much for your participation here today. It's a very, very important subject, I can tell you. In many years of practice in pharmacy, we've used many drugs that were not indicated, or at least not approved, for certain therapies that have been very, very beneficial to patients. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California. Ms. Eshoo, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses. I also want to thank our colleagues who are offering the drafts, and to Mr. Griffith, I especially appreciate your openness to to suggestions, and I think that that's very important. Over all the years that I've been in Congress, this is my 25th year, and have worked with medical device manufacturers, worked with the biotechnology industry, done legislation that has reformed how medical devices are approved, passed legislation signed into law by, I can't remember which president, relative to pediatric medications, and improved that system for children. This issue, the issues that are being discussed here today, no one has ever raised with me. So this is the first time that I'm hearing about it. And but it's good. I mean, it's a discussion, but it still says something to me that no one has contacted me about this. So I don't think it's exactly a burning issue. Number two, it's my understanding that both of the what's being offered by our two colleagues today were supposed to be a part of the overall approval for the FDA, but were pulled because they were controversial. And I can hear today where the controversy is coming from. That's legitimate, and I'm glad that it wasn't in the larger bill, because they really didn't belong there. This cake has not been baked yet. Now, it's my understanding that in one of the discussion drafts that there's no clear list of what qualifies as scientific information. Now, that is foundational to me, scientific information, not who's gabbing and saying what from a given industry. That's always interesting, and those those discussions take place. But we're dealing with over 200 million people in our country, and these words are going to walk into their life. So this is a huge responsibility. They don't know that we're here today. They don't know any of our names, but we have the public interest and the safety and the the efficacy of what takes place on their behalf. To Ms. House, I'm not sure. Are you in favor of the two discussion drafts?
We've not taken.
Yes or no?
We've not taken a formal position on
Okay,
either
that's
of them.
fine.
Neither
That's
of them
fine.
are perfect.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
But I couldn't tell from your testimony whether you were for or against or where you were. On Ms. Charo, thank you for your testimony. I think that you've set down the importance of where the information comes from, and that it can't be haphazard. There has to be a final kind of resting place that has all of the information for people in our country that can be used. I don't think anyone's really made the case here to take it outside of the FDA. Maybe I'm missing something, but I haven't heard that. To Ms. Kachadorian, I love the IAN. I share either your husband's heritage or yours. When you spoke about Hep C, how many patients were excluded from treatment?
So while I can't speak for all payers and all
No,
patients
but
that
you
were
use that
excluded-
as an example of Hep
Sure.
C.
So
Now, we know, I mean, it's a company I'm very familiar with in my district, have worked with them. They presented a cure, which we're not accustomed to. It is expensive. But who was left out,
So in the initial,
according to your testimony?
sure. So in the initial approval, we approved treatments according to the label. So for the first time in hepatitis C, we saw the criteria, the approval criteria, change multiple times. So initially excluded patients that might have cirrhosis. It initially excluded patients that, according to the FDA
And
label.
how do these drafts fix that?
So with the drafts, we could understand that there would be evidence published that would add additional clinical evidence to indicate effectiveness of treatment in those subpopulations, though at the time of the initial approval, that evidence was not available for decision-making. So in my
So
Medicare
you're saying
space,
people were excluded, but you don't know how many?
I can't speak to the exact number globally. However, within our population, Medicare is who defines our coverage criteria. So when we submit our criteria to CMS for approval, it has to be according to, for Part D coverage, what is listed in the FDA-approved label. So we cannot cover off-label unless it is within the oncology space when we're talking about a Part D
I
indication.
still don't know who's been injured in this, according to your testimony. That's why I'm asking you, and I still don't know. But I appreciate your trying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If we expand the discussion to a commercial payer outside of Part D, there are additional patients that were denied treatment.
But you don't know how many?
I don't cover commercial insurance. However, that's something I'd be happy to look into for you.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia. Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ms. Glassmeyer, we've had some discussions, and I know this is not the Judiciary Committee, but this is where the law touches everything. And so as we consider legislation in this area, just so the committee knows as a whole and that I'm better educated, what point should we be taking away from the various judicial cases and considering First Amendment challenges to the FDA's regulations? And what should we be looking out for? So that's part A, and part B would be, what should we be looking out for to make sure that we get it right and that we do it where it's constitutional as we draft this?
Thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I think, a very important takeaway from the case law is the need for clarity, and that point arises out of the intersection of the Fifth Amendment case law and the First Amendment case law. I think there's a lot of discussion about the First Amendment, but the Due Process Clause requires clarity and precision, requires rules that give regulated entities clear notice on an a priori basis of what conduct is prohibited versus permitted.
And and I don't want to cut the rest of the answer off, but let me interrupt there because that's one of my pet peeves. So many times people think that means we have to define every word in a bill, But if there's no definition in the bill, then the courts use the normal usage of the English language, or if it's a term of art, the term of art, then in this case from the medical community. Is that not correct?
It's absolutely correct, sir. And just to augment your observation, there was a conversation earlier this morning about the definition of claim and promotion, and this, where do we draw the line? And I understand why there may be some misunderstanding around that, but I have to say, as a practitioner in this area, and I also have to say I'm suffering from a little bit of an existential crisis, because the news that this is not a hot button issue or something that needs to be resolved makes me question what I've spent the last 20 years of my life doing. But that's an aside.
Not to worry, her phones will be lit up before the day is done, I'm sure.
Indeed. But there is, among those of us who practice in this area day in and day out, a very well understood line between promotional speech and non-promotional speech. So I think that the legislative measures that we've been talking about this morning would, just under foundational interpretive principles, be examined against those background legal norms. So there is a very rich body of administrative precedent from FDA, in addition to case law and the statutory foundation of the measures that you're talking about. We know what these words mean. So I agree to the extent that you're saying we ought not to feel overly anxious about those 2 or 3 words. I think folks who are battle tested in this area know the difference between promotional speech and non-promotional speech and can advise clients accordingly.
Now, I kind of got you off track there for a second. You were talking about the 1st and the 5th. I'm going to let you go back to, is there anything else on that you wanted to touch base on that I
Many things,
distracted
but I'll try to limit it to a
Yes,
big
ma'am.
ticket item, which is, if it's increasingly obvious from the case law, which goes back at least to 1976, that it's very hard for the government to defend any speech regulation that affects accurate communication regarding lawful activity. I think we tend to get hung up in kind of the Central Hudson test and prongs and that sort of thing. But just to bring it down to its essence, if the government wants to restrain accurate speech about conduct that's permitted, and off-label use is not only permitted in almost all cases, it's by federal law, it's also the standard of care in many instances, it's really got an uphill battle. So I think there is probably a way for all of these very challenging and complex policy considerations to be balanced in a smart way that takes account of the First Amendment backdrop, and I think the measures that we're talking about today have done an admirable job of striking that balance. But there's a little bit of a thumb on the scale, if you like, as a result of years and years of case law going back at least to 1976 against anything that would purport to prohibit speech that's about accurate speech about lawful activity.
And while I wasn't as concerned about the freedom of speech per se, although it's very important to me, when I put in that clause that they have to put in the contradictory information as well and the contextual information, that actually shores that up from a free speech standpoint as well, because we're saying you have to present, if you're going to present, you have to present both sides of the data. Isn't that accurate?
Absolutely accurate, yes, sir.
I appreciate that, and it does make me worry, and I know it's not their field of expertise either, but you indicated there was a late 90s case that clarifies some of this. I think the bill clarifies it more, but I'm just curious why the FDA keeps going down this pathway when they've lost a number of cases over the years, if not in this circle of the three-ring circus, in another circle of that same circus under the same tent.
Yes. Well, it is concerning because you have not only the cases that we've been talking about here, Caronia and Amarin and Pacira, but also on the dietary supplement side of the house, a great many cases from the D.C. Circuit, a lot of other sources of precedent that draw into question the constitutionality of the current scheme. That said, I think there are a lot of undeveloped arguments that we've been in industry waiting with bated breath for FDA to articulate, and there was a memorandum that FDA lodged in one of its administrative dockets in January, right before the inauguration, that purported to explain for all the world to see how the agency thought through these constitutional issues. And it was a little more than a defense of the status quo. I think there is a lot of room for optimism that in the coming months, particularly with the involvement of this subcommittee and the Congress generally, that FDA will do a better job of explaining and including stakeholders in a conversation about the constitutionality and constitutional issues associated with its current regulatory scheme.
I appreciate it and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair thanks the Ms. Castmeyer for her optimism. We always welcome optimism on this subcommittee. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel. This is a really complicated issue I'm finding. Sat here through the entire testimony. And certainly the ability, and the internet's kind of at the center of this now, for people to get hold of information about beneficial off-label use of drugs and medical devices much more readily than obviously they ever could before, is creating some pressure to figure out a way to make that opportunity more available to people. It also, the fast distribution of information can also allow for the fast distribution of bad information and lead to poor decision making. But I understand that Congressman Griffith, Guthrie, and others are trying to respond to pressure, and often it comes from patients that are seeking a solution. What I'm concerned about is that you could solve the way they're proposing for this pressure, or you could solve perhaps by building more capacity inside the FDA. So what I'm interested in hearing about, I don't want us to take a shortcut. I don't want the reason we are reaching for the proposed solution here to be that we've overlooked the opportunity to build more capacity in FDA as a way of solving for this, and perhaps solving for it in a way that protects public safety better than taking the alternative route. So I wondered, Ms. Charo, maybe you could begin here. Speak to that issue. How do we explore fully the opportunity to build capacity in FDA to respond to the pressure we're talking about? Can that be done? If so, what are the ways in which it can be done, et cetera?
Well, first, I'm going to second what's been said by others here, which is that FDA, just in terms of sheer personnel, would certainly benefit from having more people able to act on data as it's coming in, and everything would move more rapidly, with no question. But we shouldn't restrict ourselves only to FDA. I mean, one of the things we've been struggling with here is that there are areas in which the incentive systems that currently exist are inadequate for driving the research that we all agree would be ideal to figure out what really works and what does not. Pediatrics, rare diseases are two very good examples. Now, we have some new tools. Congress has given things like priority reviews and extended patent periods as incentives, but we have yet to completely explore the full range of tools. Antibiotics is another example where the Infectious Disease Society of America has been pointing out for years we could use rewards, milestone rewards. We've not talked about NIH funding for direction of studies that would look at things like off-label uses that are hinted at already and that need to be confirmed. In other words, we need not restrict ourselves to only one tool, which is to pull the industry slowly to do the research under the threat of not being able to market, but we could bring to bear a combination of tools to get the information developed more rapidly. And ideally, then, everybody would benefit because we'd have a wider range of applications, but we'd have more confidence that they've been tested in a way that is comprehensive and objective and has been vetted by independent eyes.
I appreciate that. I mean, I worry a little bit that I don't completely trust the industries we're talking about here to restrain themselves if they get, if there's an avenue for aggressively pursuing a particular product's appeal out there in ways that may compromise public safety. And I worry about sort of a bunch of camels starting to get their noses under the tent. So I understand the desire to try to accommodate people's interest in pursuing this, but if there are other ways we can respond to that without sacrificing some of these concerns about public safety, then I think that we ought to pursue those and explore some of the additional tools that you've suggested perhaps. With that, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Belarakis, 5 minutes for questions,
Thank you,
please.
Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel as well. I have a question for Ms. House. Again, thank you for your testimony. Throughout my time on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I've been involved with the rare disease community. There are about 30 million Americans have, in their 7,000 rare diseases, 30 million Americans have a rare disease, which includes pediatric cancers, and I understand there are about 500 FDA-approved treatments. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think that many of these 30 million Americans are taking medications off-label? For Ms. House, please.
Yes, yes, I do, and I do. And in my written comments, I referenced in particular lupus. And if you look at the FDA site right now, there are only 4 drugs that are approved for lupus. And the approvals of those go back into the mid-1900s. So when you look at the drugs, aspirin was approved first in 1948, followed by steroids, and there was no drug listed. There was an anti-malarial that was approved in 1955, and finally a new drug approved in 2011. So if you're a patient living with lupus, you're likely not getting aspirin as a therapeutic option for your particular disease. And certainly when you look at cancer, there's a reason why there's such a high rate of pediatrics in cancer clinical trials, and it's because they don't have a lot of other options available to them.
Thank you. And so there are other examples out there. So a large percentage of the 30 million are taking medication off-label.
Arthritis is another good example. You know, if you look at the label of methotrexate, for example, you'll see that the label doesn't reflect the broad use of that particular product. You probably speak to that better than I could. I keep pushing it.
Yeah, the mic, yeah. Thank you. I met with a young Floridian from the Miami area who told me about how she came down with ITP, a condition where her body destroyed her platelets. And I've conversed with her over a long period of time on these particular issues. I've sponsored the Open Act, and we're working together. She had to become an expert. She became an expert on ITP and really became her own doctor and found a treatment, really extraordinary. She was able to find a drug that could treat her condition. The drug was FDA approved for non-Hodgkin lymphoma and rheumatoid arthritis, but not for ITP. After a long conversation with her physician, they were able to pursue that course, the off-label treatment, and it was very successful. She comes to D.C. on a regular basis as an advocate for cures and treatments for rare diseases. Ms. House, does it make sense to withhold information from physicians and not share truthful medical information that could save a person's life? And who should be in charge of a patient's treatment? The patient working with her physician, or again, a bureaucrat? If you could answer that question, I'd appreciate that.
Well, you know, we've spent 35 years trying to assist patients to become equal participants and empowered participants in their care. So I'm going to answer that as the patient needs to be the quarterback of their care, working with their particular physician. I will say that it's incredibly important, though, that the information that is provided both to patients and to physicians is fair balanced. And I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a period of time, so I also understand the bright white lines between what is promotional and what is non-promotional. And we are not talking about shipping patients or physicians glossy pieces of information on off-label uses or on other additional informations, but we have to provide forums, and whether that is, I do agree that there are alternative solutions, whether that is through the FDA, whether it is through a professional society, whether it is through a third-party peer-reviewed entity, we have to get to a point where we are providing that data set to people who are making decisions, including patients who are making more and more of their care decisions, as you've referenced.
Thank you. Agreed. Dr. Van Heer, in your practice, you deal with children and adults who suffer from a heart condition such as the congenital heart, and some are congenital heart in nature. I sponsored a bill to reauthorize congenital heart program, and it went through this committee and hopefully on the floor as soon as possible. If you have a child that comes to the hospital with a heart condition, you might need to do a surgical procedure. How common is it for medical devices to be approved for use in children?
Well, as I understand, most medical devices, at least that I use in the cardiology sphere, are not specific to children or adults. They're more specific to actual specific arrhythmias. And as I talked about in my oral testimony, a lot of what we take care of, the devices, in fact, are not labeled for those particular sort of conditions. I will say that you sort of raised the issue of surgery for congenital heart disease. We often think about surgery as basically correcting a problem, but those patients need to have a cardiologist for the rest of their life. And one of the biggest problems that they develop are heart rhythm issues, and those heart rhythm issues are often very, very difficult to take care of. And so we are reaching for whatever we can find to treat those things most effectively. And we use technology and we use devices that have been approved for other indications for this particular situation. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that, we keep talking about pediatrics as, sort of being an important issue, and I'm a proud pediatrician, and I believe that, but I think pediatrics is a special case of a larger issue, which is there aren't a lot of patients. The devices and drugs have been developed for other indications. We have to find a way to take care of our patients. And so it's, I think, pediatric diseases, but also rare diseases, and anything that's kind of on the cutting edge of what we're doing medically to treat things are going to fall under this discussion.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've long been an advocate for those suffering from rare diseases. I was an author of the ALS Registry Act and the two most recent Muscular Dystrophy Care Act reauthorizations, and I know how much relief and encouragement new therapies can bring to rare disease patients. And I think I speak for everyone on this subcommittee when I say that all of us want to do what we can to bring effective and potentially life-saving treatments to patients as quickly as possible, but it is absolutely critical that we ensure our actions do not compromise patient safety. Efficiency is a worthwhile goal that we all share, but as we strive to hasten the delivery of new treatments, safety and effectiveness must always be paramount, and that's why this hearing is so important. Any action by this committee needs to take into account the input of expert witnesses who can speak to the potential implications of our actions. And that's what we have, Mr. Chairman, in our panel. So I want to thank today's witnesses for being here and sharing your insights. Let me start with Ms. Charo. During your testimony, you noted that approval of a drug for a labeled, I'm quoting you, indication does not mean it will be safe and effective for off-label uses, unquote, and that, quote, additional studies are needed to explore them. Now, it would seem to me that if a manufacturer wished to communicate about an off-label use for a product, that manufacturer must already have reason to believe that this product is safe and effective for the given off-label use. So if there's already evidence supporting an off-label use, can you explain why additional studies would be necessary?
Of course, and I think other people on this panel are even more expert than I in research trial design. But the reality is that evidence comes in many forms, and often it's based on small numbers of people with very homogeneous kinds of situations. But in the real world, you need larger numbers of people with a wider variety of background conditions and complexities in order to detect both the areas in which it will or will not be effective. It might depend upon comorbidities, and also to detect some of the less common kinds of side effects or adverse events. And those things are relevant to deciding whether or not the benefit that some people get will be sufficient to outweigh the kinds of risks or failures to work for other people. So initial evidence often can look extremely promising. Preclinical evidence, particularly, we've cured cancer in mice countless times, but also early human evidence is often very, very promising. And then when we move into larger trials with more complicated and more diverse populations, we discover that, unfortunately, it was misleading. And it's just a matter of basic statistics as well as medicine. That's why there's such an emphasis on properly controlled trials of sufficient size and statistical power, and the ability, too, to look at the possibility of inherent biases in how you structure the trials. It's very easy to structure trials in a way that subtly lead to one conclusion or another without even intending to do so. And that's the value of the independent expert eye that the agency brings.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kesselheim, you also touched on the need for additional studies in your testimony, so I'd like to ask you the same question. If there's already evidence supporting an off-label use, can you explain why additional studies would be necessary?
Sure. I mean, if there is evidence supporting an off-label use, then there are certainly plenty of ways that that evidence can already be communicated under the current rules. I think the rules are fairly clear about what types of communications where there are opportunities to communicate that information. And if there are additional studies, and again, I think that the importance is what is the nature of that evidence? How is that evidence defined? What are the statistical methods that were used in testing? How is the population defined? And these are details that average physicians don't know a lot, don't have a lot of training in, and don't know a lot about. And these are the details that the FDA has expertise in. And so if there are nuances that might not be caught in an initial examination of the information and additional studies that are necessary, then the numerous, dozens of experts at the FDA with training in various different fields can identify that and pick up on that and determine whether or not what might have initially be seen in the data turns out to be legitimate.
Thank you. Ms. Charo, I have one final question for you. It's my understanding that in January, the FDA released draft guidance regarding which manufacturer communications are consistent with FDA-required labeling and which are not. And I understand also that this guidance has not yet been finalized. So do you feel that draft guidance strikes the right balance between enabling potentially helpful communications to take place and protecting patient safety? And why shouldn't we legislate in this space to provide even greater clarity for manufacturers?
I do think the FDA is moving in the right direction. I agree that draft guidances would be better off if they were finalized guidances, although it's worth noting that a tremendous amount is already done through draft guidances at the FDA without any Fifth Amendment due process questions being raised about it. The thing that I think is most important about what the FDA has been doing is its insistence that actual knowledge about how your product is being used can be, in some instances, considered to be evidence that you actually intended for the product to be used that way. And I think a lot of the debate has been around that phenomenon. But we've seen that phenomenon in other contexts. We've seen it in areas having to do with constructive knowledge in tort law, where if you know that something's about to happen and you actually go ahead and do all the things that are necessary for it to come about, you're actually going to be considered to have intended that to happen in many cases. On the other hand, we've seen in the area of gun law a lot of resistance to the idea that actual knowledge should constitute intent. I do think that's an area where we have to have some more discussion to clarify, but I also think that it is risky to simply allow for an expansion of communication while simultaneously saying, but now that I've communicated more, the fact that I know that it's having an effect doesn't mean I intended that particular outcome. I think to have both of those things at once, I think, is particularly risky. Choosing one or the other at least would be the right direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks, gentleman. Does the gentleman from Texas have a unanimous consent
Chairman, I have
request?
a unanimous consent request.
I will yield
Please.
to the chairman for a unanimous consent request.
I move that we have statements in the record from the American Health Insurance Plans, the Campaign for Sustainable Drug Pricing, and also Public Citizen. Ask unanimous consent to place into the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Seeing no other members wishing to ask questions, I once again want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. I ask the witnesses to submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of those questions, and without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.